Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something out there, beyond the edges of everything we know, beyond the last flickering stars on the galactic rim, past the thin veil of light, where the Astronomicon fades into nothing, and the darkness stretches on without limit. Something vast, something patient, something so hungry that the concept of hunger itself becomes meaningless when applied to it, because hunger implies a creature that can one day be satisfied. This cannot be satisfied. This will never be satisfied. It has consumed civilizations older than the human species. It has swallowed worlds that burned with cultures and histories and living, breathing souls, and it has rendered them all into nothing more than raw material, fuel, protein, and when the last scrap of organic matter was stripped from those worlds, when the oceans were drained and the forests were dissolved and the very bacteria in the soil were harvested, it moved on. It always moves on. They call it the Great Devourer. The Imperium of man, in its need to categorize and label and contain with language that which cannot be contained, gave it a name. Tyranids, named for Tyran, the first world where the Imperium discovered the aftermath of its feeding. A research station reduced to bare rock, a planet scoured clean of every single organic molecule, as if some cosmic hand had reached down and wiped the surface like condensation from glass. The men and women who had lived there, the plants that had grown in the station's hydroponic bays, the bacteria cultures in the laboratories, even the microorganisms that had once thrived in the planet's thin soil. All of it was gone, or not destroyed in the way that orbital bombardment destroys, where rubble and ash remain as testament to what was. Simply gone, consumed, absorbed into something that had already moved on to its next meal. And when the investigators from the Imperium arrived and saw what had been done, when they stood on the lifeless rock and realized that an entire biosphere had been erased as casually as a man might wipe crumbs from a table, something very old and very primal stirred in their guts. Fear. Not the kind of fear a soldier feels before battle, which sharpens the senses and quickens the blood. This was deeper than that. This was the fear of the prey animal catching its first scent of something that does not negotiate, does not bargain, does not accept surrender. Something that sees you not as an enemy to be defeated or a rival to be respected, but simply as food. That is what the Tyranids are, not an empire, not a civilization, not even an army in any sense that the word can meaningfully convey. They are an ecosystem, a biological machine of such staggering complexity and scale that every attempt to understand it has only revealed new depths of horror. They are a swarm that spans the gaps between galaxies, a predator so perfectly evolved that the very act of fighting it only makes it stronger. Every weapon fired against the Tyranids, every tactic employed, every desperate stand made by the defenders of the galaxy, all of it becomes data, information, genetic material to be analyzed, adapted to, and eventually overcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about them, all of it. From the lightless void between galaxies where they first stirred toward our little corner of the cosmos, to the blood-soaked battlefields where the Imperium, the Aeldari, and every other faction in the galaxy have thrown everything they have against the swarm and found it wanting. We are going to talk about the hive mind, that vast and unfathomable intelligence that directs trillions upon trillions of creatures with the precision of a single thought. We are going to talk about the bioforms, from the smallest ripper to the towering biotitans that stride across battlefields like gods of chitin and acid blood. We are going to talk about the Genestealer cults, those insidious fifth columns that burrow into the heart of human civilization and hollow it out from within, preparing the feast for their masters above. And we are going to talk about the wars, the great tyrannic wars that have defined the late 41st and early 42nd millennia. Hive fleet behemoth, which slammed into the realm of Ultramar with the force of a battering ram and nearly broke the greatest space marine chapter in the Imperium. Hive fleet Kraken, which split apart like a shattered mirror and sent its razor-edged fragments spinning into every corner of the galaxy. Hive fleet Leviathan, the largest and most cunning of them all, which struck from below the galactic plane, from a direction nobody had ever thought to guard, and brought the Blood Angels to their knees on their own homeworld. So settle in. Let the ambient noise wash over you, the distant hum of void engines and the soft crackle of a Vox channel tuned to static. Because out there in the darkness between the stars, something is listening. Something is always listening. And it is getting closer. Let us begin. But first, a word of warning. What you are about to hear is not a simple story of alien invasion. It is not a tale where brave soldiers hold the line and save the day, and everyone goes home to celebrate around a warm fire. The Tyranids do not permit those kinds of stories. What we are about to explore is something closer to a natural disaster rendered in chitin and acid blood, an extinction event with a pulse and a purpose, a predator so refined by eons of evolution that fighting it feels less like war and more like trying to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. The galaxy has faced existential threats before. The forces of chaos, with their reality-bending sorcery and their legions of demons, have brought the Imperium to the brink of destruction on more than one occasion. The Orcs, with their inexhaustible numbers and their love of violence, have threatened entire sectors with their rampaging crusades. The Necrons, those ancient metal ghosts, waking from their tomb worlds in ever greater numbers, carry weapons that can snuff out stars and bend the fabric of space-time itself. But the Tyranids are different. They are different because they do not want anything that can be given. They do not seek territory that can be ceded. They do not demand tribute that can be paid. They do not worship gods that can be placated. They want everything, every cell, every molecule, every scrap of organic material on every world in the galaxy. Oh, they want to dissolve the biosphere of an entire galaxy into a slurry of nutrients and use it to fuel the next stage of their endless journey across the cosmos. And they have the means to do it. The tools, the numbers, the patience, the cold, calculating intelligence of a predator that has been doing this for longer than anyone can measure. So yes, consider yourself warned. This is not a comfortable story, but it is one of the most important stories in the entire setting of the 41st millennium and beyond. And it is told best in the dark, with the lights low and the sound of something moving just beyond the range of hearing. There is a question that haunts the scholars and strategists of the Imperium, one that they have asked in 1,000 different ways across 10,000 classified reports and sealed archives. Well, where did the Tyranids come from? The answer, as far as anyone can tell, is both simple and terrifying. They came from somewhere else, not from some hidden corner of the Milky Way, not from some unexplored nebula or forgotten pocket of space. They came from outside the galaxy entirely, from the vast and unimaginable emptiness that stretches between galaxies, that ocean of nothing where light itself seems to drown. The Tyranids are extragalactic. That word alone should send a chill down the spine of anyone who understands what it implies. The galaxy is enormous, unthinkably, staggeringly enormous. It contains somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 billion stars, and the distances between them are measured in light years. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen without ever knowing what lay beyond their own solar system. And yet the Tyranids crossed a gap that makes the galaxy itself look small. They traveled the void between galaxies, a journey that would take millions of years, even at speeds far exceeding light. They did this not in ships built of metal and powered by engines, but in living vessels, biological constructs grown from the same organic material as their warrior organisms, propelled by gravitational manipulation through creatures called narvhals, that could latch onto the gravity well of a distant star and pull the entire fleet toward it like a fisherman reeling in a line. Try to picture that journey, not the mechanics of it, not the biological engineering that makes it possible, but the scope. The void between galaxies is not just empty, it is the emptiness that empty aspires to. There is nothing there, no stars, no planets, no asteroids. At no cosmic dust, just space, stretching on for millions of light years without a single atom to break the monotony. The temperature hovers just above absolute zero. The light from the nearest galaxy is so faint that human eyes would see nothing but perfect, absolute darkness. And through this void, for millennia upon millennia, the hive fleets travel. Dormant, for the most part, their organisms in a state of suspended animation, their bioships running on the absolute minimum of biological processes needed to maintain structural integrity. The narvals sense the faint gravitational signature of a distant galaxy and begin the long, agonizing process of reeling the fleet toward it. The journey takes so long that entire geological ages pass on the worlds at their destination. Civilizations rise and fall and rise again before the first bioship reaches the galactic rim. And when they arrive, when the leading edge of the hive fleet touches the outskirts of a new galaxy, the dormant organisms awaken. The hive mind stirs. The hive ships begin to feed, consuming asteroids and cometary debris, and whatever minimal organic material can be found in the stellar nurseries of the galactic fringe. And then the real feeding begins. The question of why they came is perhaps more troubling than the question of where they came from. The most widely accepted theory within the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition is that the Tyranids were drawn to the Milky Way by a signal, a beacon, and the story of that beacon begins, as so many stories in the grim darkness of the far future do, with the Horus heresy. During those dark days when brother turned against brother and the Imperium tore itself apart, a device called the Pharos was discovered on the world of Sotha, deep in the Ultima Segmentum. The Pharos was not a human creation. It was ancient, built from a material called blackstone by the Necrons during an age so distant that the stars themselves had moved since it was placed. The Pharos functioned as a kind of psychic lighthouse, a navigation beacon that could guide travelers through the warp without the need for the Astronomicon. When the Primarch Reboot Gilliman found himself cut off from Terra by the great warp storm known as the Ruin Storm, he used the Pharos to illuminate Macragge as a rallying point for loyalist forces scattered across the eastern fringe. But the Pharos had a fatal flaw, or rather, the universe had a fatal consequence waiting for anyone who used it too aggressively. When the Night Lords, those skulking predators of the traitor legions, attacked Sotha in an attempt to seize the device, the loyalist defenders were forced to overload it. The Iron Warrior Barabbas Dantioch, a loyalist who had turned his back on his traitorous legion, sacrificed himself to trigger the overload, sending a catastrophic burst of psychic energy screaming out into the void. That burst destroyed the attacking Night Lords and rendered the Pharos silent. But it did not go unnoticed. Out there, in the cold and lightless spaces between galaxies, something felt that pulse of energy. Something ancient and ravenous stirred in the darkness and turned its attention toward the Milky Way for perhaps the first time. As like a predator catching the scent of blood on the wind, the hive mind took note of a new feeding ground, vast and teeming with life. The journey would take thousands of years. 10,000, in fact, give or take. But the hive mind was patient. It had been patient before, crossing the gulfs between galaxies on voyages that lasted longer than most civilizations endured. What was another 10 millennia? There was biomass at the end of the journey, rich, abundant, diverse biomass, the product of millions of years of evolution across hundreds of thousands of worlds. And there was something else, something that blazed like a bonfire in the psychic darkness. The Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that the Emperor of mankind projected from his golden throne on Terra, the lighthouse that guided humanity's ships through the warp. To the hive mind, the Astronomicon was not a navigation aid. It was a dinner bell, a signal fire that said quite clearly, there is intelligent life here, there is civilization, there is biomass beyond your wildest calculations. So the hive fleets turned. They oriented themselves toward the Milky Way, and they began the long, slow crawl across the intergalactic void. And while humanity fought its wars and rebuilt its shattered Imperium and forgot the lessons of the heresy, and descended into 10,000 years of stagnation and brutality, the Tyranids drew closer. Year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium. Some sources within the most classified archives of the Inquisition suggest that the Tyranids have done this before. Not just once or twice, but countless times. There are whispered theories, and supported by fragments of evidence gleaned from captured bioforms and ancient Xenos records, that the Tyranids have consumed not just one galaxy before reaching ours, but potentially hundreds, perhaps thousands. One particularly chilling account, derived from fragmentary Aeldari sources, suggests that the Tyranid species may be responsible for the annihilation of millions of intelligent species across 1,000 galaxies. If this is true, then the hive fleets that have so far invaded the Milky Way, those vast and terrible armadas that have consumed entire sectors, are not the main force. They are scouts, tendrils, the outstretched fingertips of something so large that the human mind cannot encompass it. And this is where we arrive at one of the most unsettling aspects of the Tyranid threat. Everything the Imperium has faced so far, and every hive fleet, every battle, every desperate last stand, has been against what amounts to the leading edge of the swarm. The bulk of the Tyranid species is still out there in the intergalactic void, still approaching, still drawn by the light of the Astronomicon. The wars that have been fought so far have been against the advance guard. The main body has not yet arrived. Let that settle for a moment. The Imperium has lost entire sectors, entire space marine chapters, billions upon billions of lives, fighting against what amounts to a scouting force. The full might of the Tyranid species has not yet been brought to bear against the Milky Way. And when it arrives, if it arrives, there may not be enough firepower in the entire galaxy to stop it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the wars and the battles, and the desperate stands that have defined humanity's struggle against the Great Devourer, we need to understand what makes the Tyranids so fundamentally different from every other threat the galaxy has ever faced. We need to talk about the hive mind. Imagine, for a moment, that you could take every single living thing on a planet, every human being, every animal, every insect, every plant, every bacterium, and connect them into a single consciousness. Not just a network, not just a web of communication where individual minds can share information. A single mind. One unified awareness that perceives through every eye, feels through every nerve ending, thinks through every brain all at once. Now imagine that this consciousness is not limited to one planet, but spans entire star systems. Stretching across light years of space, connecting billions upon billions of organisms into a singular intelligence so vast that it makes even the godlike entities of the warp seem comprehensible by comparison. That is the hive mind. The hive mind is not a creature. It is not a leader, not a god, not a general issuing orders from some fortified command post. It is the sum total of every Tyranid organism in existence, their collective psychic energy pooled and focused into something that transcends any individual component. Every gaunt that scuttles across a battlefield, every hive ship that drifts through the void, every microscopic organism that breaks down planetary biomass into usable material, they are all part of it. They are all thinking with it. They are all it. This is what makes the Tyranids so alien and so fundamentally incomprehensible to the minds of humans and Aeldari and every other species that has attempted to understand them. There is no enemy leader to assassinate, no command structure to disrupt, no morale to break. You cannot negotiate with the hive mind because it has nothing to negotiate for. It does not want territory. It does not seek revenge. It has no ideology, no religion, no culture. It wants one thing and one thing only: biomass, organic matter, fuel for the endless biological machine that sustains and propels the swarm. Everything else, every adaptation, every strategy, every moment of apparent cunning or creativity on the battlefield is simply a means to that single end. The hive mind communicates with its constituent organisms through a psychic medium known as the synapse. Synapse creatures, But the larger and more neurologically complex Tyranid bioforms, such as hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, zoanthropes, and broodlords, act as nodes in this psychic network. They are relay stations, amplifiers, focal points through which the hive mind's will is transmitted to the lesser creatures of the swarm. Without synapse creatures nearby, most smaller Tyranid bioforms revert to base animal instinct. They become feral, unpredictable. They might turn on each other or simply scatter, driven by nothing more than the fundamental biological urge to feed and survive. But when the synapse is active, when those relay creatures are alive and broadcasting the hive mind's imperatives, the swarm moves with a coordination that borders on the supernatural. Gaunts advance in perfect formations, their movements timed to the millisecond. Carnifexes crash through defensive lines at exactly the right moment to exploit weaknesses that no individual creature could have identified on its own. Hive tyrants direct battles with a tactical acumen that rivals and often surpasses the finest strategists in the galaxy, because they are not just one mind thinking about one battle. They are the battle. They see through the eyes of every organism on the field. They feel the ebb and flow of combat through millions of sensory inputs processed simultaneously. They adapt not in hours or days, but in seconds, shifting the entire strategy of an assault in response to a single squad of defenders repositioning behind a fallen wall. Almost every attempt by a psyker to make contact with the hive mind has resulted in insanity or death. But the sheer scale of the intelligence behind those billion alien thoughts is simply too much for a mortal mind to comprehend. There is one notable exception. Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines is believed to have touched the edges of the hive mind and retained his sanity, a feat that suggests a psychic power rivaling that of the Emperor himself. But even Tigurius has described the experience in terms that suggest the brushing of fingertips against the surface of an ocean so deep that the bottom cannot even be conceived of. He did not understand the hive mind. He merely survived its attention. And then there is the shadow in the warp. When a hive fleet approaches a star system, long before the first mycetic spore crashes through a planet's atmosphere, something happens in the Imperium. The warp, that roiling dimension of psychic energy that underlies all of reality, begins to change. The bright currents that astropaths use to send their messages across the stars dim and choke. The beacon of the Astronomicon, that constant North Star that every navigator relies on to guide ships through the Empyrean, grows faint and unreliable. Warp travel becomes dangerous, then impossible. Communications fall silent. One by one, the worlds in the path of the hive fleet go dark, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the stars. This is the shadow in the warp, and it is perhaps the most insidious weapon in the Tyranid arsenal. The shadow is not a deliberate attack, not in the way that a fleet bombardment or a ground assault is deliberate. It is a byproduct of the hive mind's presence, the psychic equivalent of static, generated by the sheer volume of alien thought bearing down on an area of space. The combined psychic emanation of billions upon billions of Tyranid organisms creates a field so intense that it distorts the warp itself, drowning out all other psychic signals like a scream drowning out a whisper. For the worlds caught in the shadow, the effect is devastating. Cut off from the rest of the Imperium, unable to send distress calls or receive reinforcements, they are utterly alone, and the psychological impact is almost as lethal as the isolation. The shadow reaches into the minds of psychers and drives them mad. Non-psychers feel it as a creeping dread, a primal unease that settles into the bones and will not leave. Religious fervor spikes. Suicide rates climb. Riots break out in hive cities as millions of people sense, on some deep and unarticulable level, that something terrible is coming and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. By the time the first Tyranid organisms make planetfall, the defenders are already broken in spirit, already isolated, already alone. Consider what that means for an average citizen of the Imperium. You live on a world that has been part of the Emperor's domain for perhaps thousands of years. You have never seen a Tyranid. You may not even have heard of them. Your world is connected to the rest of the Imperium by the web of astropathic communication and warp travel that binds humanity's scattered domains together. You go to work. You pray at the local shrine. You raise your family. And then one day, one scene. The astropath at the local garrison begins screaming and does not stop. The psykers in the Scholastica Psychana claw their own eyes out. The regimental priest falls to his knees in the middle of a sermon and weeps, unable to explain why, only that something is wrong. Something is terribly, fundamentally wrong, and it is getting closer. The Vox channels fill with static. The orbital communication relays go dark. Ships that were scheduled to arrive do not arrive. Ships that try to leave find that the warp routes are unstable, dangerous, closed. Your world is suddenly and inexplicably alone, and in the quiet that follows the severing of every connection to the wider galaxy, a sound begins. Not a real sound, not something you can hear with your ears, something deeper, something inside your skull, a pressure, a wrongness, or a sensation of being watched by something that does not see you as a person, but as a quantity of organic matter to be calculated and consumed. That is the shadow in the warp at its most personal, and it is only the beginning. The preludes to the physical horror that follows, because when the sky darkens and the first mycetic spores begin to fall, when the ground shakes with the footsteps of organisms larger than hab blocks, and the air fills with the chittering of 1 billion alien throats, the psychological damage that the shadow has already inflicted means that the defenders are fighting at a fraction of their potential before the first shot is fired. This is how the hive mind wages war. Not just with claws and teeth and bioplasma, though it has those in abundance. It wages war with silence, with isolation, with the slow or inexorable pressure of an intelligence so vast that its mere proximity is enough to shatter the will of its prey. And the most terrifying part? The shadow in the warp is not even something the hive mind does on purpose. It is simply what happens when something that large turns its attention in your direction. The horror is passive, incidental. The hive mind does not need to try to terrify its prey. Its existence alone is sufficient. To understand the Tyranids, you must abandon every assumption you have ever held about how a military force is organized. There are no factories producing Tyranid weapons, no forges stamping out bolter shells or melting down adamantium for tank armor. Every single weapon the Tyranids bring to war is alive. Every gun is a creature, or part of a creature. Every suit of armor is a living carapace grown from engineered chitin. Every ship in a hive fleet is a biological organism, vast and ancient, swimming through the void on currents of gravity. Its hull a living membrane. Its weapons sprouting from its flesh, like tumors designed for war. The range of Tyranid bioforms is staggering. The hive mind does not rely on a single design, but constantly experiments, adapts, and evolves, producing new organisms to counter specific threats and discarding old designs when they are no longer useful. Every organism is expendable. Every organism is recyclable. When a termagant dies on the battlefield, its body does not lie there and rot. It is consumed by ripper swarms, broken down into base organic components and fed back into the digestion pools of the hive fleet to be reconstituted into something new. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is permanent. The Tyranid arsenal is a living thing, evolving in real time in response to the challenges it faces. At the bottom of the hierarchy, if you can even call it a hierarchy, are the gaunts, termagants and hormagaunts, the foot soldiers of the swarm. Termagants are living gun platforms, each one carrying a weapon called a flesh borer, a symbiotic organism that launches beetle-like projectiles, hungry little creatures that burrow into flesh and devour their targets from the inside. The termagant itself is roughly the size of a large dog, covered in hard, chitinous armor and utterly expendable. They are produced in such numbers that individual casualties are meaningless. A termagant exists to advance, to fire, and to die if necessary. Aid its biomass reclaimed to make more termagants, or whatever else the hive mind requires. Hormagaunts serve a different purpose, where termagants provide ranged fire. Hormagaunts are close combat organisms, built for speed and aggression. They bound across the battlefield on powerful legs, covering ground at a pace that catches most defenders off guard, and hurl themselves into enemy lines with scything talons that can slice through flak armor and even the weaker joints of power armor. Like termagants, they are produced in numbers that defy comprehension. During the devastation of Baal, Hormagaunt swarms were observed carpeting the ground so thickly that the surface of the planet was invisible beneath their chitinous bodies. A living sea of bladed limbs and gnashing jaws rolling toward the Blood Angels' defensive positions. Above the gaunts in complexity and power are the Tyranid warriors. These are synapse creatures, relay nodes for the hive mind's psychic control, and they serve a dual purpose as both battlefield commanders and frontline combatants. A Tyranid warrior stands nearly 3 meters tall, heavily armored, and equipped with a versatile array of bioweapons that can be tailored to any tactical situation. They carry the equivalent of heavy rifles, energy cannons, and close combat weapons, all of them living symbiotic organisms fused to the warrior's body. The warriors are intelligent, at least by Tyranid standards, capable of independent action and tactical decision-making within the parameters set by the hive mind. But the true battlefield commanders are the hive tyrants, towering monstrosities that dwarf even a space marine dreadnought. Hive tyrants are the primary conduits through which the hive mind exerts its will. They are psychically powerful, incredibly intelligent, and physically devastating. A hive tyrant combines the tactical awareness of a seasoned general with the raw killing power of a walking tank, and it does so while simultaneously directing thousands of lesser organisms across a battlefield with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Hive tyrants are not truly individual creatures. When one is killed, the hive mind simply grows a new one, seeding it with all the memories and experiences of its predecessor. This is not cloning. The new hive tyrant does not merely share the DNA of the old one. It shares its consciousness, its battle experience, its knowledge of enemy tactics and weaknesses. And each death only makes the next hive tyrant more dangerous, because each death adds another layer of hard-won knowledge to the template from which the next one is grown. And then there is the Swarm Lord. The Swarm Lord is to a hive tyrant what a hive tyrant is to a gaunt. It is the apex of the hive tyrant evolutionary line, a bioform so powerful and so intimately connected to the hive mind that it is essentially the physical manifestation of the hive mind's will on the battlefield. Where other hive tyrants operate within the parameters set for them, the Swarm Lord possesses something that might be called autonomy. It can innovate, it can improvise, it can develop strategies that the hive mind itself has not yet conceived of, drawing on battle experience that spans not just centuries but eons. The Swarm Lord wields 4 bone sabers, each one crackling with disruptive psychic energy, each one capable of carving through adamantium and force fields as if they were paper. It has fought and killed champions of every major civilization the Tyranids have ever encountered. It has dueled Primarch-level opponents and Space Marine chapter masters. It has been killed many times, and each time it returns, reborn in a new body, but carrying every memory, every lesson, every scar of experience from its previous incarnations. The Swarm Lord is as old as the Tyranid species itself, and it is quite possibly the most dangerous single organism in the galaxy. Beyond the battlefield commanders, the Tyranid swarm includes a dizzying array of specialized bioforms. Carnifexes are living battering rams, massive creatures with armored hides, thick enough to shrug off bolter fire and powerful enough to smash through fortified walls. They are the Tyranid equivalent of tanks, deployed in the vanguard of assaults to crack open defensive positions so that the swarms behind them can pour through. Trigons are serpentine tunneling organisms that burrow beneath enemy lines and erupt from the ground in the middle of defensive positions, accompanied by swarms of lesser creatures that follow them through the tunnels they leave behind. Zoanthropes are psychic artillery, their oversized brains swollen with warp energy that they can focus into devastating blasts capable of annihilating armored vehicles and fortified bunkers. Gargoyles fill the skies, winged creatures that spit acidic bile and swarm defenders from above. Lictors are stealth organisms, as silent killers that infiltrate enemy positions ahead of the main swarm, picking off sentries and reconnaissance teams with chameleonic skin that renders them nearly invisible. Biovores are walking mortar platforms, launching explosive spore mines that drift across the battlefield on the wind and detonate on contact with anything living. Tervigons are mobile spawning pools, grotesque creatures that give birth to swarms of gaunts directly onto the battlefield, replenishing losses faster than the defenders can inflict them. And above all of these, literally above them in the void of space, are the hive ships. The bioships of a Tyranid fleet are among the most awe-inspiring and horrifying sights in the galaxy. They range in size from escort-class organisms, comparable to Imperial frigates, to colossal vessels that dwarf even the largest battleships in the Imperial Navy. These ships are alive in every sense of the word. They breathe, they feed, they heal from damage, they grow new weapon systems in response to the threats they face. A hive fleet does not repair its ships in dry docks. It regrows them, using the biomass harvested from consumed worlds to patch breaches, replace lost weapon organisms, and even grow entirely new vessels. Within the largest hive ships dwell the Norn queens, the mysterious reproductive organisms that produce the bioforms of the swarm. Norn queens are the genetic engines of the Tyranid species, taking raw biomass and the DNA harvested from consumed species and recombining it into new organisms. They are the reason the Tyranids can adapt so quickly, producing new bioforms within days or even hours of encountering a new threat. If a particular enemy employs heavy armor, the Norn queens will begin producing more anti-armor organisms. If the enemy uses psychers, new psychic countermeasures will be engineered and deployed. The Norn queens are the hive mind's workshop, and the galaxy is their canvas. Then there are the organisms that most people never see, because by the time they appear, the battle is already over and the consumption has begun. Ripper swarms are small, voracious creatures that flood the surface of a conquered world in their billions, devouring every scrap of organic matter they can find. They eat the dead, they eat the wounded, they eat the plants and the animals and the fungi in the soil. And they are followed by capillary towers, massive organic structures that erupt from the planet's crust and reach thousands of meters into the sky, connecting the surface to the hive ships in orbit through biological pipelines that pump raw biomass directly into the fleet. The process of planetary consumption, what the Imperium scholars have grimly termed tyrannoforming, is one of the most thoroughly documented aspects of the Tyranid threat because it is so consistent. It follows the same basic pattern every time, world after world, a procedure so refined by repetition across thousands of galaxies that it has achieved a kind of horrific efficiency. First, the vanguard organisms arrive. Lictors and genus dealers, those silent infiltrators, begin scouting the planet's defenses and eliminating key personnel. Sentries disappear. But patrol routes go unreported. The planet's early warning systems are degraded or destroyed. Then the mycetic spores fall, millions of them, crashing through the atmosphere like an organic meteor shower, each one carrying warrior organisms that spill onto the surface and begin establishing beachheads.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just give you my honest take on all of this, because I think it matters. Out of every single faction in this setting, the Tyranids genuinely unsettle me the most. And I know that sounds weird because chaos exists, the Dark Eldar exist, there's no shortage of nightmare fuel in this universe. But the thing about all of those other factions is that they want something you can understand. Chaos wants your soul, the Dark Eldar wants your suffering. You can wrap your head around that, even if it terrifies you. The Tyranids do not want anything from you. You're not special to them. You're not even interesting. You're just calories. And something about that total indifference of it, the way the hive mind would consume Shakespeare in a pile of compost with the same level of emotional investment, yeah, that gets under my skin in a way that nothing else in 40k really does. But anyways, I just wanted to share that with you all, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let's get back into it.
The initial assault is designed to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. Swarms of gaunts, millions strong, crash into defensive lines. Gargoyles darken the sky. Trigons burst from the ground behind fortified positions. The defenders are forced to fight on every front simultaneously, their lines stretched to breaking and beyond. While the main assault consumes the defenders' attention and ammunition, specialized organisms begin the real work. Xenophagic viruses and bacteria are seeded into the environment, infecting plant life and causing it to grow out of control, drawing nutrients from deep in the soil and concentrating them in biomass that is easier for the Tyranids to collect. When the defenders finally fall, as they inevitably do, the consumption phase begins in earnest. Ripper swarms flood across the landscape. Capillary towers sprout from the ground. The planet's oceans, its forests, its grasslands, its cities, everything organic is devoured. The Tyranids consume not just living things, but the organic material in the soil itself, the humus, the decaying matter, the bacterial colonies that give Earth its fertility. They drain the oceans, breaking down the water to extract the organic compounds dissolved within it. They thin the atmosphere, consuming the oxygen and other biologically relevant gases. When they are finished, or when every last molecule of usable material has been extracted and pumped up through the capillary towers into the waiting hive ships, the Tyranids leave. They leave behind a dead world, barren and lifeless, stripped to the bedrock. A world that will never support life again, because the very building blocks of biology have been removed. Not even bacteria survive. The Tyranids are so thorough that they leave nothing behind, not even the possibility of future life. And then they move on, to the next world, to the next feast. The cycle repeats, endlessly, remorselessly, across the galaxy and across the void between galaxies, a machine of consumption that has been running for longer than human civilization has existed and shows no signs of stopping. Every creature in this living arsenal serves a purpose. None are extraneous, and none are wasteful. And all of them, from the smallest ripper to the mightiest biotitan, are connected by the synaptic web of the hive mind, operating as components of a single, vast, impossibly complex organism that has been perfecting the art of consumption for longer than most civilizations have existed. Long before the first hive ship enters a star system, long before the shadow in the warp descends and cuts off the doomed worlds from the rest of the galaxy, the Tyranid invasion has already begun. It began years ago, decades ago, perhaps even centuries ago, when a single organism, moving with the patience and cunning of a born predator, slipped unnoticed onto a human world and began the slow, meticulous work of hollowing it out from within. The Genestealer is, in many ways, the most terrifying of all Tyranid bioforms, not because of its raw physical power, though a pure strain Genestealer is capable of ripping through ceramite armor and killing a space marine in single combat, not because of its speed or its ferocity, though both are considerable. The Genestealer is terrifying because of its patience, because of its intelligence, because of the way it transforms the very fabric of a human society into a weapon that will be turned against itself when the hive fleet finally arrives. The process begins with a single Genestealer, a pure strain, finding its way onto a human world. Perhaps it stowed away on a cargo ship. Perhaps it was lurking in the corridors of a derelict space hulk that drifted too close to an inhabited system. Perhaps it was deliberately seeded by a hive fleet. Launched in a spore capsule toward a world that the hive mind had marked for future consumption. However it arrives, the Genestealer immediately seeks out living hosts. It does not kill them, not right away. Instead, it does something far worse. Through a process that Imperial biologists have euphemistically termed the kiss, the genestealer injects its genetic material into its victim. This is not a wound. There is no visible mark, no scar, no evidence that anything has happened at all. The victim walks away from the encounter believing that nothing is wrong, but something fundamental has changed inside them. The genestealer's DNA has begun to rewrite their own, altering their reproductive biology so that any children they conceive will carry Tyranid genetic material. The first generation of hybrids, born to these infected hosts, are barely recognizable as human. They are grotesque things, twisted mixtures of human and alien biology, with extra limbs and misshapen features, and the distinctive chitinous claws of their genestealer progenitor. These first-generation hybrids are hidden away by their families, concealed from public view, their existence explained away, or simply denied, because the infected hosts love them. That is part of the genestealer's insidious genius. The psychic influence of the brood mind, a localized version of the hive mind generated by the patriarch, the original genestealer that founded the cult, ensures that the infected hosts feel only love and devotion toward their hybrid offspring. They cannot see the alien features, or rather, they can see them, but the brood mind rewrites their perception, rendering the grotesque beautiful, or the alien familiar, the horrifying mundane. With each subsequent generation, the hybrids become more human in appearance. The second generation retains obvious alien traits, but can pass for severely mutated humans. By the third and fourth generations, the hybrids look almost entirely human, distinguishable from normal humans only by subtle, physiological differences that would require a medical examination to detect. These later generation hybrids walk freely among human society, taking jobs, forming relationships, joining the planetary defense forces and the local government. They integrate into the world's power structures, slowly and patiently over decades. And then, by some miracle of twisted genetics, the fifth generation produces pure strain genestealers, fully alien creatures, indistinguishable from the original genestealer that started the cycle. These new pure strains can then go out and begin the process anew, spreading the infection to new hosts and new worlds, hitching rides on outgoing cargo ships and spreading the cult to the stars. The cult itself takes on the trappings of a religion. The cultists, their perception altered by the brood mind, come to see the Tyranids not as alien predators, but as gods. The star children, they call them. Angels of salvation who will one day descend from the sky and lift the faithful into paradise. The patriarch, that lurking horror in the depths beneath the hive city, becomes a messianic figure, a holy prophet whose word is law. The cult grows in secret, recruiting from the downtrodden and disenfranchised of imperial society, offering hope and community and meaning to people whose lives under the brutal yoke of the Imperium have none. By the time the Hive Fleet actually arrives, the cult may number in the billions. It may have infiltrated every level of the world's government, military, and infrastructure. And when the Patriarch gives the signal, those billions rise up at once. Planetary defense forces turn their guns on their own command posts. Power stations are sabotaged. Communication arrays are destroyed. Roads and bridges are blocked. The world descends into chaos just as the first mycetic spores are falling from the sky, and the defenders find themselves fighting a civil war and an alien invasion simultaneously. And here is the cruelest part. The cultists believe they are being saved. They rush toward the descending Tyranid organisms with open arms. They are weeping tears of joy, singing hymns of praise to the star children who have finally come to deliver them from the suffering of their mortal existence. They do not understand what is happening until it is far, far too late. Until the hive mind's psychic power overwhelms the patriarch's brood mind, and the cult members feel their free will dissolving, their bodies moving without their consent, their minds screaming inside skulls that no longer obey them. Some are driven insane on the spot. Others are simply used as cannon fodder, hurled at the remaining defenders by the hive mind, until their bodies are broken and they can be consumed along with everyone else. The cultists, who survive long enough to see the truth, to see the Tyranid organisms consuming their neighbors and friends and family without distinction, to realize that the star children they worshipped are not gods, but predators. They die with the taste of betrayal on their lips, and their biomass is harvested along with everything else, fed into the digestion pools of the hive fleet, rendered into raw material for the next assault on the next world. That is the Genestealer cult, not just a fifth column or an intelligence network, but a trap, a decades-long trap that transforms an entire world's population into unknowing collaborators in their own destruction. It is perhaps the most sophisticated weapon in the Tyranid arsenal, and it costs the hive mind almost nothing. One organism, one Genestealer, on one world, can bring down the defenses of an entire system without a single hive ship firing a single shot. The tragedy of the Genestealer cults cannot be overstated. So these are not willing collaborators with an alien enemy, not in any meaningful sense. They are victims. They are people whose biology has been hijacked, whose perception of reality has been altered at the deepest possible level, who have been turned into weapons against their own species without their knowledge or consent. The mother, who lovingly raises her hybrid child, does not know that she is nurturing a weapon. The cult leader who preaches about the coming of the star children does not understand that he is preparing his congregation for slaughter. The planetary defense trooper who sabotages his own command post in the hours before the invasion believes, with all the fervor of absolute faith, that he is serving a higher purpose. And when the truth is finally revealed, when the hive mind's psychic weight crushes the gentle brood mind that had shielded the cultists from reality, and they see, for the first time, the true face of the gods they have worshipped, the expression on their faces, that mixture of horror and betrayal and dawning understanding, is something that haunts the reports of every Imperial investigator who has ever witnessed it. Some cultists simply stop. They stand there, in the middle of the carnage, and they stop. They have nothing left. Their faith, which was the foundation of their entire existence, has been revealed as a lie. The gods they served are not gods, but appetites, and they are on the menu. There is a particular cruelty in the way the hive mind disposes of its cultists. It does not kill them quickly. It uses them. It drives them forward with psychic compulsion, of forcing them to fight and work and carry biomass even as their bodies break down under the strain of being puppeted by an intelligence that cares nothing for their survival. The hive mind burns through its cultists like fuel, squeezing every last erg of biological energy from them before discarding the husks. Their devotion, their faith, their love for their patriarch and their brood, all of it is weaponized against them in their final hours. And the cycle continues, because even as one world is consumed, Genestealers from that world's cult have already stowed away on fleeing refugee ships, carrying the infection to new worlds, new populations, new unsuspecting hosts. The disease spreads faster than the hive fleet itself, seeding worlds years or decades before the bioships arrive. By the time the hive fleet reaches a new system, the Genestealer cult has already done most of the work. It is an almost perfect system, self-sustaining, self-propagating, and almost impossible to detect until it is far too late. The Imperium of man first learned the name of its most terrible foe in the late 41st millennium, and the lesson was written in fire and blood and the screams of the dying. The year was 745 M41, and the galaxy would never be the same. For nearly a decade before the storm broke, something strange had been happening on the eastern fringe of the galaxy. Explorator fleets of the Adeptus Mechanicus, those tireless seekers of lost knowledge and forgotten technologies, had been conducting routine surveys of worlds along the galactic rim. What they found or rather what they did not find, was deeply unsettling. As planets that had been confirmed to support life in previous surveys were dead, not just depopulated, not simply ruined by war or disaster, but dead in the most absolute sense of the word, stripped of every organism, every microorganism, every trace of organic matter down to the molecular level. The oceans were gone, the atmospheres were thinned to near nothing, the gases that sustained life apparently consumed along with everything else. What remained were barren rocks, scarred and pitted, floating in the void, like the picked clean bones of some cosmic feast. The administratum, that vast and sluggish bureaucracy that manages the day-to-day operations of the Imperium, noted these reports and filed them away. Unusual, worth monitoring, low priority. The galaxy was full of dead worlds after all. War, plague, orbital bombardment, exterminatus. The Imperium had 100 tools for turning living worlds into dead ones, and it used them with disturbing regularity. A few more dead worlds on the rim were hardly cause for alarm. Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos disagreed. Cryptman was a specialist in alien threats, a man whose entire career had been dedicated to identifying and neutralizing Xenos dangers before they could threaten the Imperium. When he saw the pattern of dead worlds on the eastern fringe, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The pattern was too regular, too methodical, too clean. Whatever had killed these worlds had not done so through war or accident. It had done so with purpose and efficiency, moving from system to system along a trajectory that pointed, with chilling directness, toward the heart of the Imperium. Mes Cryptman traveled to Tyran, an Adeptus Mechanicus research station that lay directly in the path of whatever was causing the die-offs. When he arrived, he found a dead world. The station was gone. The researchers were gone. Every living thing on the planet was gone. But in a bore shaft 3,000 meters beneath the planet's surface, hidden away by the station's last surviving Margos in a desperate act of preservation, Cryptman found a data codex, a record of what had happened, a record of what had come. The creatures captured in the station's surveillance feeds were like nothing the Imperium had ever encountered. Swarms of chitinous organisms, ranging in size from small enough to fit in a man's hand to large enough to blot out the sky, pouring across the planet's surface in a living tide. They consumed everything. Whereas the station's defenders were overwhelmed in hours, their weapons, designed to fight the Imperium's known enemies, were laughably inadequate against a foe that simply absorbed losses and kept coming, filling the gaps in its ranks with new organisms that seemed to grow from the corpses of the dead. Cryptman realized what he was looking at. He also realized that it was heading for Macragge. He managed to salvage enough of Tyran's communications equipment to send a warning. The effort nearly killed his astropath, who had to punch through the edge of the shadow in the warp to broadcast the message. But the message got through, and it reached Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, who received the news with the grim resolve that had made him a legend. Calgar knew that this threat, whatever it was, could not be met with half measures. He declared that the Hive fleet, now designated Behemoth by the Ordo Xenos, following the imperial tradition of naming alien threats after ancient legends, would be stopped at Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, the heart of Ultramar, the single most fortified and defended space marine homeworld in the entire Imperium. But before Behemoth reached Macragge, it stopped to feed. The paradise world of Prandium, known as the jewel in Ultramar's crown, was a lush agri-world, its surface covered with sprawling farms and beautiful forests and crystal-clear lakes. It had no significant military garrison. It had no orbital defenses worth the name. When the Hive fleet descended upon it, Prandium died in a matter of days. Yet the Tyranids were so thorough that even the planet's atmosphere was partially consumed. The gases that had sustained life sucked away along with every other organic molecule. What had been one of the most beautiful worlds in the Imperium was reduced to a barren, lifeless husk. The loss of Prandium sent a shockwave through Ultramar. This was not a Xenos raiding party. This was not an Orc incursion or an Eldari corsair strike. This was something that could eat a world, something that treated entire planets as appetizers on the way to the main course. Calgar fortified Macragge with every weapon and warrior at his disposal. The planet's already formidable defenses were enhanced. A dozen warships hung in orbit, and more arrived daily. Battle barges and strike cruisers casting shadows over civilian vessels, dwarfed in turn by the looming bulk of orbital defense stations. On the ground, every battle brother of the Ultramarines chapter was deployed. The Codex Astartes, that sacred tactical doctrine written by the Ultramarines' own Primarch, was adapted for the first time in its history because its author had never envisioned an enemy quite like this. New stratagems were devised. Hit-and-run raids, which had served the Ultramarines so well against every other foe, were abandoned in favor of concentrated defenses and static firepower. The Ultramarines would not maneuver around the Tyranids. They would plant their feet and hold their ground, and make the swarm pay for every meter of Macragge's soil in alien blood. It was a strategy born of grim necessity. Against most opponents, mobility was key. The ability to strike where the enemy was weak and withdraw before they could respond. But the Tyranids had no weak points. They had no supply lines to cut, no command posts to raid, no flanks to turn. They were everywhere at once, a tide of organisms that filled every space, occupied every position, attacked from every direction simultaneously. Against such a foe, the only viable strategy was to choose the strongest ground available and make it stronger still. Calgar chose the fortress of Hera, the Ultramarines' own fortress monastery, and the polar fortresses that anchored Macragge's northern defense network. Around these positions, the Ultramarines constructed a defensive matrix of killing fields, fortified trenches, gun emplacements, and pre-registered artillery zones. Every approach was covered, every contingency was planned for. The defenders of Macragge knew what was coming, and they were as ready as it was possible to be. It was not enough, but it was very nearly enough. And the difference between very nearly enough and actually enough was measured in the lives of the finest warriors the Imperium had ever produced. The Battle of Macragge began in orbit. The Tyranid fleet arrived like a living cloud, thousands of bioships, ranging from small escort organisms to colossal hive ships that dwarfed Imperial battleships. The space battle was desperate from the start. The Ultramarines' fleet fought with extraordinary valor, but the Tyranid numbers were simply overwhelming. The mighty battle barge Caesar was lost in the first assault wave. By the 9th wave, Macragge's orbital defense stations had been reduced to burning debris. By the 12th wave, the orbital defenses were effectively gone. On the ground, the fighting was even more brutal. Millions of mycetic spores rained down onto Macragge's surface, each one a biological drop pod containing warrior organisms. The Ultramarines fought with the discipline and tactical brilliance that had made them the exemplar of the Adeptus Astartes, but the Tyranids adapted to every tactic. When the Ultramarines used hit-and-run attacks, the Tyranids responded with organisms designed to counter mobility. When the Ultramarines fell back to prepared defensive positions, the Tyranids produced burrowing organisms that emerged behind the lines. And then the Swarmlord appeared. This was the first time the Imperium had encountered this particular bioform. Though the Swarmlord had been destroying civilizations for eons before humanity had learned to stack one stone on top of another. At the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge, the Swarmlord directed the Tyranid forces with a tactical brilliance that systematically dismantled every one of Calgar's strategies. The creature seemed to anticipate every move, counter every gambit, exploit every weakness. It was not fighting like an animal, not even like a particularly cunning animal. It was fighting like a general who had studied war for longer than the Imperium had existed. Calgar himself engaged the Swarmlord in combat, because that is what heroes do, even when heroes know they are outmatched. The duel was catastrophic. The Swarmlord tore through Calgar's honor guard, killing the guard commander Aloysius, and inflicted such grievous wounds on Calgar that he lost both arms, both legs, one eye, and his stomach. Only the desperate intervention of Thunderhawk gunships, swooping in under heavy fire to evacuate the crippled chapter master, prevented the Swarmlord from finishing the kill. With Calgar evacuated to the battle barge Octavius in orbit, the defense of Macraga's surface fell to the remaining Ultramarines. The chapter's elite First Company, its most experienced and heavily armored veterans, was deployed to defend the northern polar fortress, a critical installation that could not be allowed to fall. What followed was one of the most desperate last stands in the history of the Imperium. The First Company held. For hours, for days, they held, their Terminator armor proof against all but the most powerful Tyranid organisms, their bolters and assault cannons reaping a terrible harvest. But the Tyranids kept coming, more and more and more, an endless river of chitin and claws and acid blood that crashed against the fortress walls and surged through every breach. When the Third Company finally fought their way through to the northern fortress to relieve their brothers, they found the First Company dead to the last man. Every single veteran, every Terminator. They lay in a circle in the lower Penetorium, their armor scarred and broken, their weapons empty, surrounded by mounds of Tyranid dead. They had fought back to back until the last one fell. The battle in orbit was ultimately decided by sacrifice. When the Tempestus fleet, over 200 warships strong, dropped out of the warp to reinforce Calgar's battered fleet, the Tyranids sprang a trap, as revealing a second fleet hidden among the rings of the nearby world of Circe. Even with reinforcements, the Imperial fleet was outnumbered. Victory came only when the Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra charged into the heart of the Tyranid fleet and detonated its warp engines, creating a catastrophic vortex that dragged both the battleship and the bulk of the Hive fleet into oblivion. Hive fleet Behemoth was destroyed, but the cost was staggering. The entire First Company of the Ultramarines was gone. Prandium was a dead world. Macrag itself would take years to cleanse of the remaining Tyranid organisms that had burrowed into its surface. And Marneus Calgar, rebuilt with bionic limbs and enhanced organs, carried the scars of his encounter with the Swarmlord for the rest of his life. But the most troubling legacy of the First Tyrannic War was the realization that Behemoth was not the end. It was the beginning. The Hive fleet had been destroyed, yes, but only half of it. The other half, the portion that had been leapfrogging ahead while Behemoth fed on the worlds in its path, had been caught in the warp vortex, scattered, broken into fragments, but not annihilated. Those fragments would seed themselves across the galaxy, hiding, feeding, growing. And they were only the first wave. More were coming. The Imperium, in its arrogance, in its willful blindness, allowed itself to believe for a time that Behemoth had been the sum total of the Tyranid threat, that the Xenos menace from beyond the galactic rim was over, that the blood of Macrag had purchased safety. But wiser minds knew better. Inquisitor Cryptman knew better. He had looked into the data codex from Tyran and seen the truth written in the cold language of numbers and probabilities. Behemoth was not an army, it was a probe, a finger extended into the galaxy to test the waters, to sample the defenses, to taste the biomass and report back to something larger, something unimaginably larger. The Imperium had won a battle, the war had not yet begun. 250 years is not a long time in the grand sweep of galactic history. Civilizations have risen and fallen in shorter spans. The Imperium barely noticed those centuries passing, consumed as it was by the 1,000 other threats that pressed in on it from every direction. The lessons of Behemoth, hard won in blood and sacrifice, were allowed to fade. The standing forces that had been maintained on the eastern fringe to guard against a Tyranid resurgence were questioned by the Administratum, those pencil-pushing bureaucrats who could calculate the cost of an armed garrison, but not the cost of leaving one undefended. And so when the signs appeared, when worlds on the eastern fringe began to erupt in rebellions and civil unrest, when military installations reported infiltration and sabotage, The administratum's analysts blamed dissatisfied populations and inadequate governance. They did not see the hand of the genestealer behind every riot. They did not understand that the rebellions were not symptoms of political failure, but the activation signal for cults that had been growing in the shadows for decades, perhaps longer. The Inquisition, to its credit, was suspicious. On inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos investigated the dissenting administratum adepts who had been advocating for the drawdown of Eastern fringe defenses and discovered something chilling. Many of those adepts had come from worlds that would later be identified as genestealer infested. Whether they were knowing agents of the cult or merely useful idiots manipulated by its influence, the result was the same. The galaxy's defenses had been deliberately weakened in preparation for what was about to come. Hive fleet Kraken struck in 992 M41, approximately 250 years after the destruction of Behemoth, and where Behemoth had been a battering ram, a single concentrated thrust aimed at a single target, Kraken was a flood. It struck across a wide front, splitting into dozens of smaller tendrils that probed and tested the Imperial defenses, seeking weaknesses, exploiting gaps, consuming everything in their path. Among the first worlds to fall were Sotha, the ancient homeworld of the Scythes of the Emperor chapter, the very world where the pharaohs had once blazed. Miral, Grya, Radnar, they fell in rapid succession, consumed by tendrils of the Kraken that moved with a speed and coordination that suggested a hive fleet far more tactically sophisticated than Behemoth had been. The Scythes of the Emperor were virtually annihilated defending their homeworld. This was a full Space Marine chapter, one of the most elite fighting forces in the galaxy, reduced to a handful of survivors in a matter of weeks. The speed of their destruction was a grim testament to the power of the new Hive fleet. Kraken's strategy was fundamentally different from Behemoth's. Where Behemoth had concentrated its forces and driven straight toward a single target, Kraken dispersed, sending tendrils in every direction, overwhelming defenders who could not be everywhere at once. This had two effects. First, it forced the Imperium to spread its own forces thin, responding to dozens of simultaneous incursions instead of concentrating for a single decisive battle. Second, it meant that even if one tendril was defeated, others continued to advance, consuming worlds and growing stronger with every planet they devoured. The two most significant battles of the Second Tyrannic War took place on opposite sides of the galaxy, and both of them nearly ended in disaster. On Ikar 4, a major hive world in the eastern segmentum, the invasion was preceded by a massive genestealer cult uprising. And then the cult had infiltrated the planet's government and military, and when it activated, the world descended into civil war just as the Hive fleet's tendril arrived overhead. The Ultramarines, once again, found themselves at the sharp end of the Tyranid threat. Marneus Calgar, rebuilt and hardened by his experience at Macragge, led the defense of Ichar 4 with the same tactical brilliance that had preserved his homeworld. And once again, he faced the Swarm Lord. But this time, the outcome was different. The Swarm Lord had grown stronger since Macragge, as it always did, its new incarnation carrying all the memories and lessons of its previous lives. But Calgar had also grown. The man who had barely survived the Battle of Cold Steel Ridge had spent 250 years preparing for this moment. When the two clashed on Ichar 4, as it was Calgar who emerged triumphant, slaying the Swarm Lord in a duel that shook the ground beneath them. Without the Swarm Lord's guiding intelligence, the Tyranid assault on Ikar 4 faltered and was eventually broken, though the planet itself was left a smoking ruin. But the battle that truly defined the Second Tyrannic War, the battle that showed the galaxy just how far the Tyranids were willing to go and how much they were willing to destroy, took place not on an Imperial world, but on an Aeldari craft world. Iyanden was one of the largest and most populous of the Aeldari craft worlds, a city-sized vessel that had sailed the stars for millennia, carrying within it one of the greatest concentrations of Aeldari civilization remaining in the galaxy. When Iyanden's far-ranging scouts brought word that a massive tendril of Hive Fleet Kraken was heading directly for the craft world, the Aeldari of Iyanden had to make a choice that no one should ever have to make. They could not outrun the hive fleet. The craft world was too slow, too massive, too cumbersome to flee. They would have to fight. Farseer Kelmon, the spiritual leader of Iyanden, declared that every Aeldari would fight. Citizens who had never held a weapon were armed and deployed as guardians. The craft world's legendary military forces, its aspect warriors and grav tank formations, were mobilized in their entirety. And in a decision that spoke to the desperation of the moment, Kelmon ordered the awakening of the Wraithguard, constructs animated by the spirits of Iyanden's dead, and housed in spirit stones within the craft world's infinity circuit. To disturb the dead was a profound act of sacrilege in Aeldari culture, but Kelmon had no choice. The living alone could not hold against what was coming. The shadow in the warp descended on Iyanden 20 days after the scout's warning. For a week before the first physical attack, the craft world was isolated, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, its seers blinded and its communications severed. The Tyranid bioships arrived in their tens of thousands, blotting out the stars, a living armada so vast that it dwarfed the craft world itself. The battle for Iyanden was an apocalypse in miniature. In the void, Aeldari warships dueled Tyranid biovessels in running battles that spanned thousands of kilometers. On the craft world's surface, as Tyranid organisms poured through breached domes and shattered corridors, flooding the pristine halls of Iyanden with chitinous bodies and acid blood. The Eldari fought with the desperation of a people facing extinction, and still they were pushed back, step by step, chamber by chamber. The tide turned only when Prince Iriel returned. Iriel was an exile, a former autarch of Iyanden who had been banished for his arrogance. He had become a corsair, leading a fleet of Aeldari raiders on the fringes of the galaxy. But when he saw his home burning, when he felt through the psychic bonds of his people, the death agonies of tens of thousands of Iyanden's children, he turned his fleet around and charged into the heart of the Tyranid swarm. Iriel's corsairs struck the Tyranid biofleet from behind with devastating effect, crippling hive ships and breaking the orbital blockade. Then Iriel himself descended to the craft world's surface, where the defense had all but collapsed. In the final desperate battle in the Fortress of the Red Moon, Iriel confronted the hive tyrant that commanded the ground forces. Armed with the Spear of Twilight, an ancient and cursed Eldari artifact that consumed the life force of its wielder with every use, Iriel drove the weapon through the hive tyrant's skull, killing it instantly. Without the synapse creature to coordinate them, the Tyranid ground forces fell apart, reverting to base instinct. The Eldari, battered and bloodied and on the brink of annihilation, rallied and began systematically destroying the disorganized swarms. Iyanden survived, but 4/5 of its population was dead. Its fleet was a shadow of its former glory. Its halls, which had once rung with the music and poetry of a civilization that counted its age in millennia, were silent. The Wraithguard walked the empty corridors, ghosts in living armor, the spirits of the dead more numerous now than the living. The Second Tyrannic War ended with the defeat of Kraken's main tendrils at Ichar IV and Iyanden, but Kraken was never truly destroyed. Dozens of splinter fleets escaped into the depths of Imperial space, scattering in every direction, consuming undefended worlds and growing stronger. These splinter fleets continue to haunt the galaxy to this day, a cancer that metastasized before it could be excised. What made Kraken so insidious was not just its military power but its aftermath, and the splinter fleets that scattered from the main body of the Hive fleet did not simply drift and die. They fed. They found worlds that had been left undefended because every available garrison had been redeployed to the front lines of the Second Tyrannic War. They consumed these worlds quietly, growing stronger, producing new organisms, evolving new adaptations in response to the local threats they encountered. Some of these splinter fleets became significant threats in their own right, capable of threatening entire subsectors with forces that had been born from a handful of surviving bioships and a few hundred consumed worlds. One splinter fleet made its way into the Damocles Gulf, where it encountered the Tau Empire. The Tau, who had never dealt with Tyranids before, attempted diplomacy. They sent ambassadors. They offered negotiations. The Tyranids ate the ambassadors. The Tau learned, rather abruptly, that not every problem in the galaxy can be solved with the greater good and a polite conversation. Another splinter fleet reached the Farsight enclaves, the renegade Tau settlements beyond the Empire's borders. This was the catalyst that drew Commander Farsight out of his mysterious retirement and led to the formation of his legendary bodyguard unit, the Eight. Even in the far corners of the galaxy, Kraken's reach extended, touching civilizations that had believed themselves safe from the horrors of the galactic West. Perhaps most worrying of all was the encounter at Valador. When surviving elements of Kraken stumbled upon a tendril of the later Hive fleet Leviathan on the world of Duriel, Aeldari Farseers from Eandon foresaw a catastrophe. Two Hive fleets feeding on each other would not weaken both, as one might hope. Instead, the victor would absorb the genetic material and biomass of the defeated, becoming something far more dangerous than either fleet alone. The Eldari of Ayandon and Biel-Tan, assisted by Dark Eldar allies of convenience, were forced to destroy the entire planet to prevent the two fleets from merging. The destruction of Duriel was an act of desperate pragmatism that illustrated a fundamental truth about the Tyranid threat. Sometimes the only winning move was to deny the Tyranids what they wanted, even if it meant destroying what you were trying to protect. And the Imperium learned a terrible lesson. Defeating a Hive fleet's main body did not end the threat. It simply transformed it from a concentrated assault into a dispersed infestation that was, in some ways, even harder to combat. The Third Tyrannic War began less than 5 years after the conclusion of the Second. 5 years. The Imperium had barely begun to count its dead from Kraken when the signs appeared again. Worlds going silent on the southern fringe, communications failing, the shadow in the warp descending like a shroud over entire sectors. Inquisitor Cryptman, that indefatigable hunter of alien threats, was the first to recognize what was happening. He implemented what became known as the Cryptman Census, a massive astro-telepathic survey that attempted to contact every documented world on the fringes of the Imperium. The effort was brutal. Dozens of astropaths were burned out, their minds destroyed by the effort of projecting through the gathering psychic interference. But the responses, and more importantly, while the lack of responses, formed a pattern, and the pattern was terrifying. The new Hive fleet, designated Leviathan, was approaching from below the galactic plane, not from the eastern fringe, where Behemoth and Kraken had entered, from below. From a direction that nobody had ever considered, because nobody had ever imagined that a threat could come from beneath the galaxy itself. Leviathan was striking upward, its tendrils spreading in a jaw-like formation that was designed to envelop and engulf entire sectors before the defenders could even determine the direction of the attack. Leviathan was also enormous, larger than Behemoth and Kraken combined. The Hive fleet advanced in two main prongs, hundreds of light-years apart, converging like the closing jaws of some unimaginably vast beast. Worlds fell by the dozen, consumed so quickly that the Imperium could not mount effective defenses before the next system was already under attack. Cryptman, watching the pace of Leviathan's advance with mounting horror, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could not stop the Hive fleet, not with the forces available to him, not with the speed at which it was moving. So he decided to slow it down by removing its food supply. The logic was cold. The logic was impeccable in its brutal mathematics, and the logic required the deliberate extermination of billions of the Emperor's own subjects. Cryptman ordered exterminatus on a string of inhabited worlds directly in Leviathan's path. If there was no biomass for the Hive fleet to consume, it would starve, it would slow down, or it would give the Imperium time to muster a proper defense. The Cryptman line, as it came to be called, was a cordon of dead worlds, a firebreak of exterminated planets designed to channel Leviathan's advance and deny it the resources it needed to continue. It worked, after a fashion. The Hive fleet's advance slowed, Some tendrils turned aside, seeking richer feeding grounds elsewhere, but the cost was staggering, not just in lives, but in political capital. Even the Imperium, which considered exterminatus a legitimate, if extreme, tool of governance, balked at the wholesale destruction of inhabited worlds to fight an alien threat. Kryptman was stripped of his authority by the Inquisition, his colleagues horrified by the precedent he had set. But Kryptman had one more gambit. Us observing that certain tendrils of Leviathan were still advancing despite the cordon, he devised a plan of breathtaking audacity and questionable sanity. He captured a brood of genestealers and released them into the territory of the Orc Empire of Octarius, a densely populated cluster of greenskin-held star systems teeming with the fungal biomass that orcs generated wherever they went. The genestealers would draw the attention of the hive mind. The hive mind, sensing a rich and practically limitless source of biomass, would divert a significant portion of Leviathan's forces to attack the orcs. And the orcs, being orcs, would fight back with everything they had. The resulting conflict, known as the Octarius War, was everything Kryptman had hoped for and feared in equal measure. The Tyranids attacked Octarius with overwhelming force, pouring billions of organisms into the Greenskin Empire. The orcs responded with their characteristic enthusiasm, launching massive counter-assaults and bellowing their savage war cries as they hurled themselves into the chitinous horde. The two species, both designed by nature and evolution for endless war, locked into a cycle of escalating violence that consumed both sides in staggering numbers. But the problem with Kryptman's plan was that both the Tyranids and the orcs grew stronger through conflict. The Tyranids consumed orc biomass and used it to produce new and more powerful organisms. The orcs, stimulated by the constant fighting, grew larger, stronger, and more numerous, as their fungal reproductive cycle responded to the stress of war by accelerating growth. The Octarius War did not produce a winner, yet it produced two ever-growing armies locked in a feedback loop of escalating destruction, and nobody in the Imperium was sure which outcome was worse: a victorious Tyranid hive fleet bloated on orc biomass, or a victorious orc empire energized and expanded by centuries of continuous war. Meanwhile, the main body of Leviathan continued its advance, and it had set its sights on a particular target, one that carried a significance far beyond its strategic value: Baal, homeworld of the Blood Angels. The story of the devastation of Baal is one of the most harrowing in the entire history of the Imperium. When news reached Baal that the defenses of the Cryptus system, the fortified worlds that had been intended to shield the Blood Angels' homeworld from exactly this kind of threat, had collapsed, Commander Dante, the oldest living space marine in the galaxy, put into motion the largest gathering of the sons of Sanguinius since the Horus Heresy. Dante summoned every successor chapter of the Blood Angels that could answer the call: the Flesh Tearers, the Blood Drinkers, the Carmine Blades, the Angels in Carmine, the Knights of Blood, an excommunicated chapter that had been declared renegade by the High Lords of Terror, but who answered anyway, because when the Father's house is burning, even disowned sons come home. Over 30,000 Space Marines gathered at Baal, along with vast numbers of mortal conscripts drawn from Baal's population, forming a defensive force that would have been considered overkill against any conventional enemy. It was not enough. The tendril of Leviathan that descended on Baal was of such mass that even after its considerable losses in the preceding campaigns, it blotted out the stars when viewed from the planet's surface. Over 50,000 bioships, an armada so vast that the Imperial fleet, for all its mighty battle barges and strike cruisers, was like a handful of pebbles thrown against a tidal wave. The space battle was lost almost from the start. Imperial warships carved burning swathes through the biofleet with nuclear warheads and lance batteries, destroying hundreds of hive ships in the opening salvos. But for every ship destroyed, 1,000 more pressed in. One by one, the Imperial vessels were isolated and overwhelmed, battered by organic missiles and enveloped by swarms of smaller bioships that chewed through hulls and spilled warrior organisms into the corridors within. On the ground, Dante had constructed a 3-layered defensive line around the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, the Arx Angelicum. The first 19 waves of Tyranid organisms were repelled, each one larger than the last, each one pushing the defenders closer to the breaking point. 5 chapter masters fell in battle during those terrible days. The ground was so thick with Tyranid dead that the defenders had to use flamethrowers to clear fields of fire, burning the bodies of the fallen organisms just to maintain line of sight. And then the Swarm Lord arrived, reborn once again, carrying the accumulated tactical knowledge of every battle it had ever fought. The Swarm Lord took personal command of the Tyranid ground forces. Its presence galvanized the swarm, infusing the mindless hordes with a strategic cunning that turned the tide of battle decisively in the Tyranids' favor. The first defensive line fell. Then the second. The void shields of the Arx Angelicum held for a time, but the hive mind adapted, spawning organisms specifically designed to burrow beneath the shield projectors and destroy them from below. The mortals defending the outer walls broke and fled, and who could blame them, facing a horror that no amount of faith or discipline could prepare a normal human being to endure. In the final desperate hours, Dante himself faced the Swarm Lord, the oldest space marine against the oldest Tyranid, a duel that seemed to carry the weight of entire civilizations on every blow. Dante was exhausted, wounded, running on nothing but willpower and the genetic legacy of Sanguinius himself. The Swarm Lord was fresh, powerful, and supremely confident. Dante won. How he won, precisely, is debated by historians and tacticians to this day. But the undeniable fact is that Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, at the end of his strength and the end of his hope, drove his weapon through the Swarm Lord and killed it. Again. As he always would, as every great champion of the Imperium seemed to do, defying the odds at the moment when defiance seemed most futile. But killing the Swarm Lord was not enough. The Tyranid hordes continued to pour in. Baal was being stripped bare, its deserts consumed, its moons scoured. The defenders retreated to the Arx Angelicum itself, surrounded on all sides, fighting room by room through their own fortress. And then the Great Rift tore open across the galaxy, the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, that vast wound in reality that split the Imperium in two, unleashed chaos in every sense of the word. Warp storms erupted across Baal's system. Demons materialized in their millions, pouring out of the newly opened rift. And among them came Ka'Bandha, the bloodthirster of Horn, ancient nemesis of the Blood Angels and Sanguinius. Ka'Bandha descended on Baal with a legion of cornate demons and declared, in a voice that shook the mountains, that no one would destroy the Blood Angels except him. The demons fell upon the Tyranids with a ferocity that even the hive fleet could not match. Chaos and the Great Devourer clashed across Baal's moons and in the skies above the planet, and for once the Tyranids found themselves fighting an enemy that provided no biomass, no genetic material, no fuel for the swarm. The demons were creatures of the warp, and their bodies dissolved back into the immaterium when destroyed, leaving nothing for the hive mind to consume. The arrival of the Great Rift cut off additional Tyranid reinforcements from reaching the system, and then, at the last possible moment, the fleet of the Indomitus Crusade dropped out of the warp above Baal, led by none other than the resurrected Primarch Rabute Guilliman himself. Guilliman's forces swept the remaining Tyranids from Baal in a devastating series of actions that combined fresh Space Marine companies with the advanced technology of the new Primaris Marines. Leviathan's assault on Baal was broken, but the system was devastated. The planet and its moons were barely habitable. Most of the Blood Angels' successor chapters had been reduced to shadows of their former strength, and on the barren surface of Baal Prime, all that remained was a mountain of Tyranid skulls, arranged into the 8-pillared symbol of Horn. Kabanda's calling card. His way of saying, "These were mine to destroy, not yours." In the aftermath, Guilliman named Dante as Lord Regent of the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy cut off from Terra by the Great Rift. It was a recognition of Dante's unbreakable will, but also an acknowledgement that the fight against the Tyranids was far from over. The Third Tyrannic War did not end cleanly. There was no single decisive battle, no moment where the defenders could look at each other and say, "It is finished." The devastation of Baal broke the largest tendril of Leviathan that had been directed at the Corwood Ultima Segmentum. But the Hive fleet was vast, far vaster than any single tendril, and its other branches continued to assault the galaxy from multiple directions. The formation of the Great Rift had complicated matters immensely. Warp storms that erupted in the wake of the rift cut off Tyranid tendrils from one another, disrupting the hive mind's coordination. In some cases, this worked in the Imperium's favor, as isolated tendrils lost synapse coherence and reverted to feral behavior. In other cases, it made things worse, because tendrils that were cut off from the main fleet evolved independently, developing new and unpredictable adaptations that the Imperium had no experience countering. And then, just when it seemed that Leviathan had been contained, if not defeated, the hive mind demonstrated once again why the Tyranids are the most terrifying threat in the galaxy. It adapted. The Fourth Tyrannic War erupted in the era Indomitus, when a new and massive concentration of Hive Fleet Leviathan, larger even than the force that had assaulted Baal, attacked the western reaches of Segmentum Pacificus. This was not the eastern fringe, where the Imperium had been expecting Tyranid threats and had deployed accordingly. Segmentum Pacificus was far from the traditional Tyranid invasion corridors. Its worlds were poorly defended. Its military forces were depleted by decades of fighting against the forces of chaos that had poured from the Great Rift. The attack came from above and below the galactic plane simultaneously, in a coordinated pincer movement that demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that stunned even the most experienced Tyranid scholars. 3 new tendrils spearheaded the assault. Hive Fleet Nautilon struck from below the galactic plane. Hive Fleet Promothor attacked from above. Hive Fleet Grandillus moved along the galactic rim, cutting off potential reinforcement routes. Together, the 3 tendrils formed a net that was slowly closing around Segmentum Pacificus, consuming worlds and growing stronger with every system they swallowed. The most alarming aspect of the Fourth Tyrannic War was its direction. The 3 tendrils were converging on a trajectory that pointed, with undeniable directness, toward Segmentum Solar, toward Terra, toward the Astronomicon itself, at that great psychic beacon that had been drawing the Tyranids for 10,000 years. For the first time in the history of the Tyrannic Wars, the threat was not to some distant frontier or isolated chapter homeworld. It was to the heart of the Imperium itself. Guilliman, recognizing the gravity of the situation, reinforced Segmentum Solar and dispatched several newly founded Primaris Space Marine chapters to the front lines of the Fourth Tyrannic War. But the Imperium's resources were stretched thin. The Indomitus Crusade was still ongoing. The Great Rift continued to spawn chaos incursions that demanded attention. The Orc Empire of Octarius, far from solving the Tyranid problem as Kryptman had hoped, he had produced a super-empowered Orc warlord who now threatened Imperial space with a greenskin horde that had been tempered by decades of war against the Swarm. The galaxy was burning on every front, and the Tyranids were only adding fuel to the fire. The minor hive fleets that accompanied or followed the Great Three deserve mention as well, because they illustrate the sheer diversity and adaptability of the Tyranid species. Hive Fleet Gorgon, for example, invaded the Tau Empire and distinguished itself through its exceptional speed of biological adaptation. When the Tau deployed a new weapon system, Gorgon's organisms developed resistance to it within days. When the Tau adapted their tactics, Gorgon produced new bioforms specifically designed to counter those tactics within weeks. The Tau, whose entire military philosophy was built around technological adaptation and innovation, found themselves locked in an evolutionary arms race that they simply could not win. The only reason the Tau survived Gorgon was that the Hive fleet was relatively small compared to the major incursions, and was eventually ground down by attrition, but the experience left a deep mark on Tau military doctrine. Hive fleet Jormungandr specialized in subterranean warfare. Its organisms burrowed deep beneath the surface of targeted worlds, emerging without warning in the heart of defended positions. Imagine standing guard on the walls of a fortress, watching the horizon for approaching swarms, only to have the floor beneath your feet erupt in a cascade of dirt and chitin and scything claws. Jormungandr was destroyed by Admiral Vortigern Hanroth at the Battle of the Black Nebula in 995 MF41, but its remnants went dormant, burrowing into worlds across the Ultima Segmentum and lying in wait. When Leviathan's advance stirred the warp and sent psychic ripples across the galaxy, those dormant strains began to wake, erupting from worlds that had believed themselves safe, adding yet another front to a war that already had too many. Hive Fleet Kronos appeared to be the hive mind's specific answer to the growing threat of chaos in the galaxy. Unlike other hive fleets, which avoided warp-tainted areas because chaos corruption offered no usable biomass, Kronos actively sought out demonic incursions and warp rifts. It spawned massive numbers of psychic bioforms, zoanthropes and neurothropes, and the newly evolved neurotyrants, are organisms whose synaptic power was so intense that they could strengthen the shadow in the warp to the point where it physically disrupted demonic manifestation. Kronos fought chaos directly, closing warp rifts and banishing demons through sheer psychic pressure, not out of any moral opposition to the ruinous powers, but because chaos was competing with the Tyranids for the galaxy's resources. The enemy of my enemy is, in the hive mind's calculation, simply a different priority target. And then there is Hive Fleet Tiamat, perhaps the most mysterious and unsettling of all the known Tyranid presences in the galaxy. Tiamat is not a traditional hive fleet. It does not advance. It does not consume worlds in the conventional sense. Instead, it has occupied a cluster of star systems and has begun doing something that the Ordo Xenos finds deeply alarming. It is building. On the jungle world of Zeophoria, the primary world of the Tiamat system, the Tyranids have been constructing a massive biological structure. This is not a capillary tower or a digestion pool. It is something else entirely. Imperial observers, the few who have managed to get close enough to see it and survive, describe it as a living psychic resonator, a vast organic antenna of unknown purpose that pulses with synaptic energy detectable from light years away. The Ordo Xenos has speculated endlessly about what Tiamat is building. Some believe it is a signal booster designed to strengthen the hive mind's psychic control over the galaxy. Others think it is a beacon, intended to guide the main body of the Tyranid species toward the Milky Way with greater precision than the Astronomicon alone could provide. A few believe it is something worse, something that no one in the Imperium has a frame of reference for. Whatever it is, Tiamat guards it fanatically. Every attempt to destroy or even closely examine the structure has been met with overwhelming force. Entire Deathwatch kill teams have been lost trying to reach Zeophoria. The system has been fusion bombed on several occasions, and life continues to flourish, sustained by the Tyranids' relentless biological engineering. Tiamat is patient, Tiamat is building, and nobody knows what happens when the construction is complete. The Octarius War, that deliberately engineered clash between Tyranids and Orcs, deserves a fuller telling as well. What began as Kryptman's desperate gambit to divert Leviathan's forces into a mutually destructive conflict with the Orcs of the Octarius Empire evolved into something far worse than anyone had predicted. The Orcs and the Tyranids did not destroy each other. They fed each other. The Tyranids consumed Orc biomass and used it to grow bigger, more powerful organisms. The Orcs, stimulated by the endless fighting, grew larger, tougher, and more numerous. The fungal reproductive cycle of the Orcs went into overdrive, producing new warriors faster than the Tyranids could consume them. And the Tyranids adapted, evolving new organisms specifically designed to counter Orc physiology. The war escalated and escalated and escalated. The orcs produced a war boss of staggering power, a creature energized by decades of continuous warfare, as leading a battle-hardened greenskin horde that had been forged in the furnace of Tyranid combat. On the other side, the Tyranid organisms that emerged from the Octarius conflict were some of the most lethal bioforms ever recorded, their genetic templates refined by generations of warfare against one of the galaxy's most resilient species. The Octarius War eventually ended, but neither side was truly defeated. Both emerged stronger, more dangerous, and now freed from the other's attention, able to turn their enhanced capabilities against the rest of the galaxy. Kryptman's gambit had bought the Imperium time, but the interest on that loan was going to come due, and the payment would be measured in blood and worlds. And the worst part, the thought that keeps Inquisitors awake at night and drives astropaths to weep into their hands, is that this is still only the beginning. The hive fleets that have invaded the Milky Way, all of them, Behemoth and Kraken and Leviathan, and every splinter fleet and tendril and offshoot, represent only the outermost fringe of the Tyranid species. The main body is still out there, still approaching, still drawn by the Astronomican's call. The hive mind has been testing the galaxy's defenses for 2.5 centuries. It has sampled the biomass. It has catalogued the defenders' weapons, tactics, and capabilities. It has probed every weakness and noted every strength. And with each hive fleet, with each invasion, it has grown more sophisticated. Behemoth was a blunt instrument, a battering ram aimed at a single point. Kraken was cleverer, dispersing to exploit weaknesses across a wide front. Leviathan was smarter still, striking from an unexpected direction, with forces that adapted in real time to every countermeasure the defenders employed. Each hive fleet has been a lesson, a trial run, a test, and the hive mind has been learning. What comes next, when the main body arrives, will make everything that has happened so far look like a prelude. We have spoken of battles and bioforms, of hive fleets and hive minds, of wars that span sectors and tendrils that consume worlds. But to truly understand the Tyranids, to grasp what they represent in the vast, dark mythos of the 41st millennium and beyond, we need to step back from the tactical reports and the casualty counts and consider something more fundamental. What does it mean when nature itself becomes the enemy? Every other threat the Imperium faces can be understood in human terms, and at least to some degree. Chaos is corruption, the dark mirror of human emotion twisted into divine malice. The orcs are aggression personified, the joy of destruction made flesh and given fungal spores. The Aeldari are tragedy, a fallen civilization haunted by the ghosts of its own excess. The Necrons are undeath, the horror of immortality without purpose. Even the Tau, with their naive optimism and their caste-bound society, represent something recognizably human, the belief that the universe can be made better through cooperation and technology. The Tyranids represent none of these things. They are not evil. Evil requires intent, and the hive mind has no intent beyond consumption. They are not cruel. Cruelty requires an awareness of suffering, and the hive mind is no more aware of its victim's suffering than a hurricane is aware of the houses it destroys. They are not even hostile, not in any meaningful sense. Hostility implies opposition, and the Tyranids do not oppose anyone. They consume, that is all. The fact that consumption requires the destruction of entire civilizations is, from the hive mind's perspective, no more significant than the fact that breathing requires the inhalation of air. This is what makes the Tyranids so fundamentally terrifying. You cannot reason with them, you cannot intimidate them, you cannot appeal to their mercy or their self-interest or their sense of honor or their fear of death, because they possess none of these things. Every strategy that relies on the enemy being, on some level, comprehensible, breaks down when applied to the Tyranids. They are not playing the same game as everyone else. They are not playing a game at all. They are eating. And yet there is a terrible beauty in the hive mind's design. The elegance of a system so perfectly optimized for its purpose that waste has been literally evolved out of existence. Nothing is lost. Nothing is discarded. Every organism serves a function. Every death feeds the machine. Even defeat is, in a sense, victory, because every lost battle provides data that makes the next assault more effective. The Tyranids are, in purely biological terms, the most successful species in the galaxy. Perhaps in all the galaxies they have consumed. They have achieved something that no other civilization, no matter how advanced, has ever accomplished. They have made extinction itself sustainable. The Imperium fights on. Of course it does. The Imperium has no other choice, because surrender to the Tyranids is not submission, but annihilation. There is no negotiated peace, no treaty, no accommodation. There is only resistance or consumption, and the men and women and space marines who stand against the swarm do so knowing that the odds are, in the most literal sense, astronomical. But they stand. They stand on the walls of fortress worlds with laser guns that feel like toys against the chitinous hides of carnifexes. They stand in the void, aboard warships that are hopelessly outmatched by the living armadas of the hive fleets. They stand because someone has to, and because the alternative is not merely death, but the complete erasure of everything they have ever been or ever could have been, their worlds, their cultures, their memories, their very DNA, consumed and repurposed into ammunition for the next invasion. There is something profoundly noble in that, something that transcends the grim, dark cynicism of the 41st millennium. In a universe where there is only war, where every faction is flawed, and every victory is temporary, and every hope is shadowed by the certainty of eventual defeat, the simple act of standing up against the great devourer and saying no, not today, not this world, not these people, that act carries a weight that few other moments in this setting can match. The Tyranids do not care about that nobility. They do not acknowledge it. They will consume it along with everything else, if given the chance. But the nobility is there nonetheless. And as long as there are beings in the galaxy who choose to fight, who choose to resist, who choose to stand between the swarm and the people they have sworn to protect, the Tyranids have not won. Not yet. There is a phrase that soldiers use on the walls of fortress worlds when the chittering of the swarm grows loud and the shadow falls across the sun. They say it to each other in those last moments before the wave hits, when the ammunition is running low and the barricades are cracking, and the noise, that ceaseless insectoid noise, threatens to drown out thought itself. The phrase changes from world to world, from regiment to regiment, but the meaning is always the same. We are still here. We are still fighting. The swarm has not taken us yet. On Macragge, when the first company made their last stand in the polar fortress, they reportedly transmitted a single message before the Vox channels died forever. That message was never officially released by the Ultramarines, but those who have seen the classified records say it was simple. The line holds. They were dead within hours, but the line had held. For those hours, against impossible odds, against an enemy that outnumbered them by millions to one, the line had held. On Iyanden, when the last defenders of the craft world gathered in the fortress of the Red Moon and prepared to die fighting, the Farseer Kelmon sang a hymn that had not been sung in 10,000 years, a death song from the age before the fall, when the Aeldari still believed in endings that carried meaning. The hymn spoke of light persisting in darkness, of voices echoing long after the singers had fallen silent. Kelmon died that day, but the hymn survived, carried by the spirits in the Infinity Circuit, and it is sung to this day on what remains of Iyanden. On Baal, when Commander Dante faced the Swarm Lord amid the ruins of his chapter's ancestral home, with the blood of 30,000 space marines soaking the sand beneath his feet, and the sky black with bioships, and the air thick with spores, he did not pray for victory. He did not even pray for survival. According to the few witnesses who were close enough to hear, Dante simply said, "For Sanguinius," and charged. The oldest space marine in the galaxy, battered and bleeding and more tired than any immortal warrior had a right to be, threw himself at the most dangerous single organism in the galaxy because that was what was needed. Because someone had to. Because if no one stood, then everyone fell. These moments matter. Not because they changed the strategic calculus of the tyrannic wars, not because they altered the trajectory of the hive fleets or diminished the hive mind's hunger by even a fraction. They matter because they are proof that the galaxy's inhabitants are not merely prey. They are beings who can choose to stand even when standing is futile, who can find meaning in resistance even when resistance is doomed. The Tyranids strip worlds of their biomass, but they cannot strip away the significance of a choice made in full knowledge of its consequences. The Swarm Lord will return, as it always does. New hive fleets will emerge from the void, bearing designations that the Ordo Xenos has not yet dreamed up. New worlds will fall silent as the shadow in the warp descends. New heroes will rise to face impossible odds, and many of them will die, with their names added to casualty lists that grow longer with every passing year. But the war goes on. The great wheel turns. The galaxy refuses to be consumed quietly. And out there, in the darkness between the stars, the hive mind is watching. It is patient. It is ancient. It has consumed civilizations that made the Imperium look like a campfire in comparison, and it was barely slowed down. It has all the time in the universe, but so does the will to resist. And that, perhaps, is the one thing the hive mind has never successfully devoured. We could keep talking about the Tyranids for hours. The minor hive fleets, like Gorgon with its adaptive hypertoxins, or Jormungandr with its subterranean assault doctrines, or Kronos, the fleets specifically evolved to combat the forces of chaos. The ongoing war in Octarius, where orcs and Tyranids continue to fuel each other's growth in a conflict that might eventually produce a threat worse than either one individually. The mysterious activities of Hive Fleet Tiamat, which has been constructing some kind of massive biological structure on the jungle world of Zeophoria, a psychic resonator of unknown purpose that keeps the Ordo Xenos up at night with speculation about what it might be for. There is always more when it comes to the Tyranids. There is always another tendril, another splinter fleet, another world going silent. The scope of the threat is so vast that no single narrative can encompass it. The Tyranids are not a story with a beginning, middle, and end. They are a condition, a constant. The universe is full of things that want to eat you, and the Tyranids are the biggest, most efficient, and most implacable of them all. What makes the Tyranid threat unique in the lore of the 41st Millennium is the way it forces the galaxy's warring factions into uncomfortable positions. The Imperium, which considers all aliens to be abominations worthy only of extermination, has found itself fighting alongside Aeldari forces on multiple occasions during the Tyrannic Wars. At Ikar IV, Aeldari warriors fought beside Ultramarines. At the Cryptus system, Necrons allied with Blood Angels against the Swarm. These alliances are temporary, fragile, and born entirely of desperation, but they happen. The Tyranids are the great unifier, the threat so overwhelming that it forces enemies who have hated each other for millennia to put aside their differences, however briefly, and fight shoulder to shoulder. Even chaos, that ancient and implacable enemy of all living things, has found itself in opposition to the Tyranids. The forces of the dark gods thrive on emotion, on the psychic resonance of mortal minds caught in the grip of passion and fear and despair. The Tyranids offer none of this. Their organisms have no souls. Their hive mind generates a psychic phenomenon, yes, but it is utterly alien to the warp, a wall of white noise that drowns out the whispers of daemons rather than feeding them. When the Tyranids consume a world, the souls that would normally fuel the eternal hunger of the Chaos Gods are simply gone, swallowed by the shadow in the warp before the denizens of the Imperium can claim them. For the first time in their ancient existence, the Chaos Gods face an opponent that threatens to starve them, not through faith or purity or resistance, but through the simple expedient of removing their food supply. Kabanda's intervention at Baal was not motivated by any desire to save the Blood Angels. It was motivated by a far more primal concern. If the Tyranids consumed the Blood Angels, the souls of those warriors, the genetic descendants of Sanguinius, would be lost to Khorne forever. Kabanda would rather see the Blood Angels survive and suffer and fall to the Red Thirst than lose them to an enemy that would not even appreciate what it had consumed. The Tyranids have achieved something remarkable. They have given the Chaos Gods a reason to preserve, at least temporarily, the very mortals they have spent 10,000 years trying to corrupt and destroy. The Necrons, those ancient metallic remnants of a civilization that predates the rise of humanity by millions of years, have their own complex relationship with the Tyranids. The Necrons are almost entirely mechanical, their living metal bodies containing no biomass worth consuming. For this reason, Tyranid hive fleets have been observed making significant course corrections to avoid Necron tomb worlds, calculating that the energy expenditure of combat with the Necrons would not be justified by the negligible biomass reward. This makes the Necrons one of the few species in the galaxy that the Tyranids will voluntarily avoid. But the Necrons are not indifferent to the Tyranid threat. Some Necron dynasties, particularly the Mefrit and their leader Anrakir the Traveller, has recognized that the Tyranids threaten the biological species that the Necrons might one day need to reverse their biotransference. If the Tyranids consume all organic life in the galaxy, the Necrons' dream of reclaiming flesh and blood bodies becomes impossible. Other Necron lords, particularly the enigmatic Zarek, the Silent King, have taken an active interest in combating the Tyranids, reportedly traveling to the edges of the galaxy to assess the true scale of the threat, and returning with warnings that have shaken even the most ancient and imperturbable of the Necron overlords. The Tau, youngest and most optimistic of the galaxy's major civilizations, have had perhaps the most instructive encounter with the Tyranids. The Tau genuinely believed, when they first encountered the swarm, that diplomacy might work, and that the Tyranids could be reasoned with, bargained with, perhaps even integrated into the greater good. The Tau sent envoys. They broadcast messages of peace and cooperation. They offered to share resources and territory. The Tyranids consumed the envoys and continued advancing. The Tau learned a lesson that older, more cynical civilizations had known for millennia. Not everything in the galaxy can be understood. Not everything can be negotiated with. Some things are simply hungry. All of this, the alliances and the enmities, the desperate stands and the bitter lessons, serves to underline a single fundamental truth about the Tyranids. They have changed the galaxy, not just through the worlds they have consumed or the populations they have eradicated, though those losses are staggering. They have changed the way the galaxy's inhabitants think about themselves and each other. The Tyranids have forced the warring factions of the Milky Way to confront the possibility that their ancient grudges and territorial disputes are, in the face of an extinction-level threat, profoundly irrelevant. Whether the galaxy's inhabitants will actually learn that lesson is another matter entirely. Hope and wisdom have always been in short supply in the grim darkness of the far future. But for now, let us leave the great devourer where we found it. Out there, in the dark, getting closer. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, from the lightless void between galaxies to the blood-soaked battlefields of Makraga and Ayandan and Baal, then thank you. Your time and attention mean everything. But if you enjoyed this dive into the lore of the Tyranids, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you might think. And if you are not already subscribed, consider joining us. There is so much more of this incredible universe to explore together, and I promise you, we are only getting started. Until next time, stay safe out there. Keep the lights on. And if you hear something scratching at the walls in the small hours of the night, try not to think about what it might be. The Emperor protects, but against the great devourer, even he may not be enough.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.